Hi, guys, and welcome to another episode of the Burning Desire Show with me, Charles Burns. And today's guest is Noah. Is Healy the correct pronunciation? I always have checked that before.
Healy, yes,
Yeah.
Healy is the correct pronunciation.
Great. So we have Noah, and as per usual, we're going to kind of dig into Noah's past, present, and hopefully what he's looking to do going forwards. So, having kind of done some research on yourself, the thing that kind of stands out is your would you call it a passion or obsession, or you're certainly super interested in mathematics, right? That's your kind of
Absolutely. I've always had a calculational facility. I was, the fastest counter and the fastest adder and the fastest multiplier and on and on and on, even into college. I had a professor in my probability class who lectured with a pocket calculator, so he could make up examples and then type in and actually run along. And um, I could do the computations he was doing at the board faster than he could. He could type them into the calculator. So that became an interplay of how that lecture evolved to work, is that he would sort of put an example up on the board and then sort of pause and look at me, and I'd announce what the what the next step of the calculation was. Um, but it really sort of supercharged when I got out of school. Started working in computer programming, which hadn't been a huge interest of mine during my school years. I'd been exposed, but it never really triggered, and read the foundational papers, and some of the award lectures by the guys that wrote the programming languages and so on. And it's the most profound idea that humans have ever had, and there's a reasonable argument to be made. It's the most profound idea that it's possible to have. Essentially, computational mathematics placed a boundary on imagination and described the properties of that boundary. The the good news for people like me who, you know, have hope for imagination and creativity and so on, is that um, most of those things are incomputable. So while there are limits, we only know where a few of them are, and we can't know where all of them are, because there's no process by which we could actually figure that out. But whereas we used to sort of think of creativity as limitless, we actually now know there are there are some very specific outer boundaries, and research has been ongoing, uh, that have established uh, new relationships between things that we really had never seen before. For example, just this year, I believe, it's been determined that effectively trust and understanding are opposites of each other, and that one of them exists in our universe, and we don't know which one it is. But if we solve certain mathematical problems, we will actually resolve that and live in a universe that has one or the other of those things available. And this gets related to things like cryptography, and compression, and communication theory.
so. Just stepping back a minute, when did you become aware that you were your brain was faster, I suppose, in a mathematical sense than your peer group? Was it kind of your parents noticed when you were young that you were just kind of faster at kind of counting and those sort of simple things, or was it when you were in college that with this kind of pocket mathematics kind of?
I actually didn't spend a lot of time around other children my own age in my young childhood. There were a couple of kids in the neighborhood. I have a brother that's a couple years younger than I am. Um, but I was sort of an outdoorsy kid and used to spend hours every day, walking through the woods and the creek that were around the house I grew up in. Um, I I sheared off pretty quickly once I got into kindergarten. So I was the quick counter, and we had an enrichment program. I'm old enough that they were still giving everyone IQ tests, and so the high end of the IQ test would go into the enrichment program. And so around first grade, um,
What age is that for people that aren't from the US? What age is that?
that'd be 6 years old.
Okay.
It was becoming clear that I was a lot better at sort of math and reasoning than my peers were.
Mhm.
Um, but I couldn't spell worth a damn. So I was kind of it 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 wasn't sort of like a Doogie Howser type of a like grade skipping thing. I was better at this and worse at these other things, and just sort of in the mix. Um, uh, but it did keep happening. And as I got older, more opportunities for advanced mathematical instruction became available.
Mhm.
So there was a specific mathematical enrichment program in middle school, so around 11 to 13, um, where I distinguished myself. And we actually, uh, our local schools had a pilot program that I was a part of to skip pre-algebra, so essentially skipping seventh grade mathematics. And it is now standard practice in the school system for the advanced mathematical students to do that. I was one of three kids that was the first people that actually did this to see if it was plausible. Um, then, in a really weird wrinkle between my uh, freshman and sophomore years of high school, so this would be uh, sort of like 14 to 15, um, a cluster of students whose parents were, I live in a university town, so the University of Virginia is sort of right across town from me. Uh, a cluster of children who were a year older than me, whose fathers were all members of the math department and were friends with each other, were all going to my school. And those fathers convinced the school to put on a summer program of pre-calculus, which they then tutored their sons in so that their sons could take the AP calculus test in their junior years. Um,
So how ahead of schedule would that be age-wise?
um, so any AP class is basically 1 year ahead of schedule if you're taking it in your senior year, because they are freshman college
Okay.
classes. So you're 1 year ahead of schedule. If you're taking that as a senior, they were prepping to take them as juniors, so they would be 2 years ahead of
Right.
schedule.
Right.
I joined the class to go in as a sophomore, so I'm 3 years ahead of schedule at this
Wow.
point. Um,
So your father, you said you just it was right thinking your father was involved with their mathematics department.
no, their fathers were
Oh,
involved with the mathematics department,
right. Yours
which
was
is
not.
why, yes. My father was a builder, and then became a tile salesman. He's retired these days.
Well, I don't know your parents or maybe even your brother. Have you got more than just your brother, or have you got?
I'm the oldest of six children. My
Wow.
parents divorced and remarried, and they had two children in each iteration. So
So are any of your siblings or your parents or like extended family, are they into maths or have you done it as a career, or are you quite an outlier even with the in family?
I do have the younger of my two half sisters is a civil engineer. I think she just got her PE. She's been going for it for a little while. So she and I are sort of the most similar that way. I have the younger of my two half brothers, might even be smarter than I am. He he was picking up things faster as sort of a toddler, but he's like 18 and a half years younger than I am. Um, he's out in San Francisco, and he's into music. Uh, I've got two of us are musical, um, and then mostly we're sort of working office jobs and that kind of thing. I'm I'm the one that's sort of furthest into just math and computers.
Do you think because I'm interested in this again, it comes from, I suppose, a bit of the Malcolm Gladwell outliers. You might have come across that possibly, the kind of theory that 10,000 hours of practice makes you an expert. Do you think that you naturally had a gift, it would seem, in maths, but did you practice an awful lot more than other people, or it just came naturally to you? Is the what one part one question? And part two
Um,
would be, did you
I-
thoroughly enjoy it and therefore became easy to?
it's definitely sort of both of those things. So as an example, uh, in first grade, I can clearly recall counting exercises where they would have little fields of like triangles and squares that were different colors, and you were supposed to, on little mimeograph machine, pages, and you were supposed to fill out the workbook. And so I was the first child in my class that went up to the teacher, and then I saw the teacher sort of count across and count down, you know, 5 across, 3 down, check 15, and so on. And it was like, well, that's cool. Let's figure out what's going on there. And started working through that and sort of worked out the times tables. And then, a year later, when they were teaching the times tables, I was I'd done that a year ago myself, and when I sort of saw the times tables and the two times tables, I was like, well, you can multiply large numbers, and so just sort of write down a couple of random numbers and see if you can multiply them together, and you can, and that's cool for a couple of times. But doing that sort of does give you some practice. Later, uh, in algebra, our teacher insisted that we memorize or be able to quickly produce the squares of the first 100 numbers. So he gave that to everybody to go home overnight and memorize the squares of all the numbers from 1 to 20, and then by fives up to 100. So what's 25 squared, 30 squared, and so
Mhm, mhm.
on. That was an exercise. We did it, but once you start playing around with it, multiplication is also the difference of squares, and so I sort of noticed this and built that into my repertoire. So um, there's sort of this like averaging and variance trick. So 7 times 9, for example, which averaged to 8, multiply to 1 less 1 squared, the difference from their average of 8 squared. So 64 minus 1 is 63, which is 7 times 9. That's not terribly useful unless you can rapidly produce the squares of large numbers. And then you can turn multiplication into addition and subtraction problems. And that's sort of one of my interests, is that the whether or not squaring numbers is actually easy, which geometry suggests that it probably ought to be, or actually hard, which all current practice suggests is actually the case. Um, so then that becomes the kind of thing that I can think about, whether or not you can do something with.
Did you so you that whole piece you were talking about with the squaring and the difference and that you just figured that out yourself with no external kind of input really?
Yeah, well, it's actually fairly obvious, I guess, if you've ever looked. So a standard piece of pedagogy um, is a multiplication square. So usually they go up to 12. You numbers 1 through 12 on top, 1 through 12 down the side, and then all the products written out.
Yeah.
So 144, and innumerable 7, 8, 9, and 10-year olds have been shown this and forced to regurgitate it. If you sort of study one of those things, something you'll notice, the main diagonal obviously are all the perfect squares.
Mhm.
But if you sort of go off at right angles from the main diagonal, um, one, it's completely symmetric. So, 7 times 9 equals 9 times 7.
Mhm.
But the other thing is that the differences are also perfect squares. So, um, 8 times 8 is 64, 7 times 9 is 63, 6 times 10 is 60, 5 times 11 is 55, that's 9 less, and
Sure.
so on and so on and so on. So if you're actually looking at that thing and sort of picking up patterns, it pretty quickly becomes obvious that there's a relationship for those numbers. And
Mhm.
then once you realize, how fractions work and so on, um, and sort of the continuous version of that, it becomes clear that that's just always true. And yeah, it was just.
That makes sense. So then moving on from your kind of school, your early school period, then to your what we call it undergraduate in the UK. I'm not sure if you call that in the States, but certainly your degree,
Yes.
basically, was in engineering science and also nuclear engineering, which both are interesting. How did that come about?
Well, because of the starting calculus in high school thing, our local school had a program where if you completed a course of study, you could continue that study at college, and they would pay for it. So I went to UVA for 4 semesters, taking mostly math classes. I took a intro computer science class as well. So when it came time to apply to colleges, UVA was was very understanding about accepting the credits that they had already given me. A lot of colleges uh, wanted to classify those credits as high school
Right.
graduation requirements, um, which wasn't true. I didn't need those classes to graduate from high school. They're not that strict at Charlottesville High School.
Yeah.
Um, and kind of rubbed me the wrong way. And UVA was, more or less forced to accept that their classes were acceptable as part
Yeah.
of a program. So I wound up there, uh, and I'm not much of a writer, so I figured I'd write less in the engineering department. That turned out to be false, but what are you going to do? And you have to declare a major after your first semester.
Mhm.
Uh, and I didn't really have a set direction. So um, engineering science is a department for structuring programs outside of normal uh, the normal streams. It was largely existed to set people up to go to graduate school,
Mhm.
and feed into one of their graduate departments. You specifically aren't allowed to do what I actually did, which is wander around the school and take classes that look interesting off the syllabus. But my advisor thought I was really smart and was just like, sure, you want to do something? That's probably a good idea. I'll sign whatever you want. So that's what I did. And so I took a lot of math classes, several science classes. The engineering science degree, I call it the mad scientist degree, the one I got. The sort of key electives that control how the thing works are where your lab works are and what your sciences are. And my labs were radiation detection and robotics, and my sciences were genetics and general relativity. So that's not anything. Like, nobody is doing that, whatever that is. However, um, I had followed a professor who had taught one of the sort of introductory engineering courses into an introductory nuclear course, just because he was a good professor. I was like, that's probably a good class. I'll go take that.
Mhm.
The nuclear department was being shut down at the time, so there were a few classes left over, but there was no department to join. But during one of his classes on reactor safety, uh, I came up with this wholly impractical solution to this purely science fiction problem that he posed. And he said that that could be the basis for a senior thesis, which was that was the writing assignment you couldn't avoid if you were in the engineering school. Is that in order to graduate, you had to put together a thesis. So he introduced me to the guy who became my thesis advisor. I took a couple classes from him and wrote up something that wasn't really all that related to my sort of fantasy thing. It was more of a extracting information from computer modeling as a mathematical exercise, and mostly just a sort of journal survey. Uh, it's, I kind of I did some computations that hadn't been done and wrote them down, but that was mostly to pad the length out. But then he offered me a fellowship to do a year of graduate school. Um, so a free year in school, and I had no idea what I was doing. Sure, I'll let you pay me to go take even more math classes. So I did, and then that was I was the last person admitted to the nuclear engineering department, which they were shutting down.
It's interesting because I've got lots of friends in the States, and with you call it college, we call it university, let's call it higher education. You guys are, I think, have a far more sensible approach in respect of being able to pick and choose classes and to effectively, for want of a better phrase, mix and match kind of based on your interest, etc. Whereas here, even as far as when you're 15, 16, decisions you make on what you're taking in your like school can certainly impact what you can then take in your like college slash we call it university here. And the university courses tend to be very prescriptive. So you go study law or you go to study, in your case, nuclear engineering, but you don't then have like a side piece where you'll do Russian or this or that. Either it does exist a little bit, but it's certainly not the main. Whereas I find your approach, I think, is far more leads itself to people actually enjoying what they're doing and furthering their passions than just this prescriptive, like you're doing law, everyone does all these classes, like that kind of thing.
Yeah, actually, UVA is a real forefront for that. They have a sort of academic, honors program called the Eccles program, which I was in a sister program for the engineering school.
Mhm.
But if you're in the Eccles program, or the Rodman, the one I was in, you you have second priority. So graduate students get to sign up first for classes, but you got second choice, and then third choice goes to second semester, fourth years, basically people just about to graduate, and then it goes down in priority
Mhm.
from there. And then the other thing is unrestricted access. So a professor can require approval for entry to a class, or they can have prerequisites where you have to have taken, and passed class X to take my class. Um, Eccles can't get past professor approval. So, if Mr. Johnston hates you and doesn't want you to study, you know, psychiatry, you can't make him. But there are no other requirements. So you don't have to take Calc 3 before taking Calc 4 if you think you're up to it.
Interesting.
Uh, and and actually the Eccles program, the Rodman doesn't have this, but the Eccles program has the Eccles degree, where if you accumulate 120 hours of passing grades at the university and you're in the Eccles program, you can just graduate. So you don't have to declare any major at all, or have followed any program of study. You could just go out and take whatever struck your fancy for roughly 4 years. And
That is interesting. So from there, you did briefly mention before you stumbled into the kind of the computing world, for want of a better phrase. Was that just kind of someone put into it? You
well,
started reading on it, or
that's another one of those kind of weird backwards things. So I was a head of the board gaming club at the University of Virginia. And I don't know if you're familiar with a board game called Settlers of Catan.
no,
Uh,
not my
okay.
game.
It uh, we were one of the first places in the States that started playing it. The first stateside distributor was actually headquartered in Charlottesville as a result of its popularity. It was invented in Germany in the 90s, became wildly popular. And we were playing, like, it was one night a week, but we would play 5 or 6 games at every one of these sessions. Um, and people from the community also joined this club, and one of them was the CTO of a internet startup company.
Yep.
uh, and he loved Settlers of Catan. He got really good at it, but not as good as I was.
Just brief. That's
So
a CTO, is a chief technology officer or technical officer, depending. We don't
yes,
know. Yeah,
yeah. He had more or less written the entire first draft of their entire company, and the entire process of the company growing was hiring other people to do parts of his job.
yeah.
So yeah, it was a very bright guy. And as I was getting ready to graduate the second time and actually have to have a job, they were hiring, and so
Mhm.
he was like, "I know you're smart because you've been kicking my ass at games for 3 years. Come on down and apply." So I did, and they were they were Linux, Perl, um, uh, a bunch of words that I'd never heard before, uh, kind of shop. Um, but a lot of computing interviews revolve around giving people some logic problems to chew on, and I've been really good at logic problems for as long as I can remember. So I kind of sailed through the interview process,
What
and
would that
then
be? Like, what's an example of, like, not the actual problem, but what are they talking about in that respect?
uh, well, one of the best ones I've ever had at any interview uh, was, let's say you had a really large list of sorted numbers, of really large sorted numbers. So you've got trillions of numbers that are between, 1 and quintillion, say.
Mhm.
Um, and you want to find one number. Like, you're given a number, is that number in the list? Um, And sort of very simple way to do that would be a divide and conquer. So, it's like look at the halfway point of the list. Is it bigger or smaller?
Right.
Fine in. Uh, because of the sizes of what's being talked about there, that would take about 40 steps to solve. Another solution that you could try would be to guess. So you're given a number. You know that these numbers are sorted. You know that they go from 1 to quintillion. You know that there's about a trillion of them. What if you took the number divided by sort of the difference between those two things, which in this case is about 1,000,000. So just chop the lower 6 digits off this number, and then go to that location and look for it. Like, because that's approximately where it would belong if these things were evenly distributed, which you also know. Well, it turns out that if you do that, if you go to that location and look around, that that's faster. In fact, if you're capable of sort of picking up a few things at a time, that will converge almost instantaneously. Um, and so that's actually, guessing is actually a better solution than sort of looking. Um, uh, and I got that question on a phone screen interview with Google once, and
Okay.
came up with that answer on the fly. Came up with both those answers on the fly, and that got me a ticket to California, which didn't turn into a job, but that was still a fun experience.
That's cool. So what were they? What was the role? Is it a kind of engineering role or?
Yeah, I've always been doing back office engineering with Google. It's a little unclear. Their system is sort of a plug and play, so they don't really they sort of hire people, not positions,
Right.
and then people sort of move to where they're looking for. Uh, and yeah, I don't think I had the technical expertise they were looking for. I I've always kind of cheated the technical knowledge in some sense by having really solid theoretical fundamentals. So I'm not up to the second on every kind of technology that's ever existed, but I'm really really good on how things work. So uh, I had I had somebody come in and quiz me on like how hard drives function, um, and I hadn't extensively studied hard drive function, but based on file algorithms, and searching algorithms, which I was familiar with, I was able to sort of on the fly construct what reasonable behaviors would have to look like for them to function. And so I got through that one okay.
So you do this piece of app programming based on this CTO you met at this board game club. I guess did you then kind of fall in love with computer programming as a way to use your passion and what you're good at in the math sense and problem solving to go, oh, hold on a minute, this is a opportunity for a career progression where I can kind of add value in different places, that kind of thing?
You know that opportunity was definitely good. I was learning a lot. And this was 2000, so it's fairly early days of the internet. And there was enough downtime at that job, because they wanted me to sort of train up and learn how to do these things, that I had the time to do the research. And the thing that's great about learning programming and computational mathematics is that since essentially all of it was discovered in the 20th century, um, and most of it was created by the people who created the internet, um, or their immediate mentors.
Mhm.
Uh, it's all online. So and it's all hyperlinked and high indexed and so on. So it's not actually that physically difficult to find this stuff and read this stuff. It's a lot of work to like understand this stuff and keep going. But um, there's there's no esoteric book at the back of this library on the other side of the planet you have to find. It's all sitting in your phone right now,
Yeah.
everywhere around the world. Uh, and so that I just really deep dived into all those things, and each paper has a bibliography, all of which are also online,
You just
some
kept
of
going
which,
on and on.
yeah, comes with hyperlinks. So yeah, you just start going down the rabbit hole, and pretty soon you realize there's a warren, and then in a little while you realize there's a structure, and then you've basically read all of it. And so uh, that that happened. That job lasted a year because 2000 was the peak of the dot-com boom. That peak didn't last very long. Um,
What was the company doing generally as a
they were a pioneer in social gaming, actually. It was Merv Griffin's ex-wife and her sister had hooked up with some guys doing proto apps on the internet. So if you're familiar with Jeopardy,
Mhm.
she invented Jeopardy.
Oh, okay.
So they they were good at coming up with game shows, and were trying to pitch new game show ideas to television networks. And they met a
Mhm.
couple guys who were like, well, you know, TV is kind of saturated with game shows. They got Bob Barker and Alex Trebek. So what if your ability to create games that millions of families love to watch, you turn them into these computer app things, and then we let people play them instead of watching
Mm.
them. And so they were like, yeah, sure, let's go with that. So they picked up my buddy Chris and had him write all that stuff up. And they had a plug-in, back when browsers worked that way, that had sort of lobby and team build features and so on. And they'd put you in a little group with a couple other people, or I think it was up to five, uh, and give you these problems. And then there'd also be a chat screen. So the players could go in and sort of do these little puzzly things, while chatting with each other, and then they sold ad revenue, and they got a decent rate because it was mostly middle-aged women, um, and sort of in the demo females that were engaging with their product, which in late 90s 2000s was basically unheard of, as an internet subgroup that you're
Mhm.
attracting.
Mhm.
Uh, Unfortunately, uh, they they took their $20 million that they got, and spent all of it on game content. So they had hundreds of each of these games for the players to play, uh, and the average player played three of them. So so overspending by 3,000% caught up to them, and when valuations went south, and the next source of funding didn't look like it was going to happen, they just had to close their doors.
Got
Um,
you. And then you stayed within the gaming world, I suppose, but into the oh no.
not immediately, no.
Okay.
So I skipped over to some people that were building systems for scientific papers, publishers. and workflow systems,
Mhm.
and started developing a programming language there, and built a few internal apps for them, and some platform stuff so that they could build apps on top of. And then they had a change in direction, and so sort of started bouncing back and forth, doing uh, back office automation stuff for the most part, and kind of gluing together systems, some admin here and there.
And then you come into the slot machine world, right? That's the next kind of thing.
Yeah. So I had sort of a long-term hiatus from work. My house burned up, actually,
Wow.
which was that's not fun at all. I can't recommend it. Nobody was hurt. Uh, nothing nothing other than stuff was destroyed. But yes, I came home one night from the grocery store, and like film set levels of flames were coming out of the windows of my house.
Wow.
And yeah, so it was about a year of sleeping on my parents' couch, and kind of then student housing for a little while, and overseeing the reconstruction, and uh, getting things back together, and then needed a job again. And uh, there was a company in town that was making and leasing slot machines to Indian casinos. Um, and that's a highly regulated industry. Uh, they were growing very quickly, and they needed what's called configuration management, which is important in any IT structure. It basically is about tracking uh, the versions of what you're working on, and coordinating multiple people's versions so that they don't get out of sync with each other. Um, it's more important in that industry because uh, repeat repeatability in the build process isn't just important from an engineering and product point of view. It's also a legal requirement. And not only is it a requirement that you can repeat the build process, um, independent laboratories that aren't necessarily technically enabled the way your staff is need to be able to repeat on demand any given build process that's ever been shipped by you anywhere. And all your clients also have to be able to do that. And the regulatory agencies also have to be able to do that, because what's allowed on a casino floor has to be agreed to have been fair by the government, the client, and independent auditors. So in order for them to be able to certify that, they all have to be able to see the source code and be able to know that the source code that they've seen is actually what's running on the
Sure.
box. Um, and so that was a pretty interesting technical challenge for a few years. Then then they and I basically parted ways. I built a system for them which did everything that they needed, and then they had a policy of no career opportunities. That came direct. I had a meeting with the CEO. That was their policy. So I was done. There were no opportunities. Time to go. I had money in the bank. I did a little traveling, and decided to spend some time seeing if I could think about anything. Just really, you know, get into thinking about computational mathematics. Uh, I had one highly esoteric breakthrough that's not really all that important for anybody. Uh, and then I found this heuristic that's based around this project I'm working on. This this new kind of strategic situation in game theory I call negotiation games. Basically a way to structure systems of common interest to be able to seek out the best, in some sense, common interest that's available, and that's where the marketplace system comes from, and where my current work lies. And then a competitor that started up, I did work for them for a little while as a day job, but I left them this summer, and getting back into doing this full time.
That's the company called Coordisc, right?
Core disk is, yeah, that's my little corner of the world.
So for a layperson, what are you trying to? What's the problem, and what's your solution?
So the problem is that markets are becoming more expensive and less predictable. And the solution is to change the way that people interact with marketplaces to make those interactions more transparent and honest by using information theory to measure directly the transparency and honesty of behavior and directly reward people for that. Um, so markets exist, and there's some sort of general knowledge about them. There are obviously specific instances of differences, but they're basically all the same. They're sort of large collections of buyers and sellers.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this constantly jittering price of where the buyers and sellers are coming together. And thanks to computers, that price jitters incredibly quickly. There are a million opportunities a second on the major markets in Chicago for the price to change. Um, the the that structure will tend to cause the price to equilibrate around where the sort of true price actually is. So you could imagine a world where everyone knew what everybody's interests were, and then it would be clearly obvious how much it would be worth to make something, or how much it would cost to buy something. But we don't and can't live in that world. Like, none of us are omniscient. Certainly not all of us are omniscient. So we have to sort of approximate instead, and that's what we use markets for, is that approximation. um, People have different levels of knowledge, though, and so if you know more on average than other people in the market, there's an opportunity for you to make money by taking advantage of them when they're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And that's good. That's actually how these markets function. Unfortunately, as the sort of opportunities for price differentials increase, what's happened is that there are more opportunities for people to go wrong and be taken advantage of in ways that don't communicate the information from the people who are right to the broader marketplace. So uh, you get sort of a madness of crowds effect happening, where large passions can kind of move things around in ways that are real, but also not valuable. And the series of global bubbles that have been blown and then exploded over the last generation or so are all indicative of that. And that problem is rooted in this indirect knowledge. Basically, you get paid by the marketplace in two ways. One, by actually knowing more than your average counterparty, but
Hmm.
two, by concealing what you know from counterparties, allowing you to keep knowing more than your average counterparty.
Right.
And that second thing isn't economically useful. Um, the value of the market is its promulgation of knowledge. So if technologies come into existence, which they have, that's what computers are really great at, that allow that part of the market to stop working, well, the market loses value directly in proportion to that. So we have this situation where our huge technological improvement is actually making our economies function worse, and it's a direct relationship. So as we continue to improve the technology, our economies will continue to get worse in function.
Okay. You mentioned quite in your, and this is from your LinkedIn profile. I saw this, which is pretty interesting about you call yourself an algorithmist with a conscience, and the kind of the importance of ethics and morality in tech. Is that again underpinned from what you were just saying about what your work, your current work with your current company? Is that again like an underpinning principle of why you're doing what you're doing as well?
Absolutely, yeah. The algorithm has become a dirty word, because of really very evil behavior by companies that are operating uh, off of algorithms. But algorithm is basically a descriptive noun, for uh, a very useful and incredibly common thing. Um, Cookbooks are books of algorithms, um, and that's really all an algorithm is. It's a recipe.
Mhm.
It's a set of instructions for doing something, where if you carry out the instructions, something happens. Um, we've come to associate algorithms with, you know, big tech, creepily listening at your doorbell or whatever, which is absolutely what is happening. The things like Alexa are effectively always on, so they can optimize your search profile and stuff like that. And Facebook knows more about, or the I don't know if you guys have Target, but there's a famous case. Target's a department store in our country,
Mhm.
and uh, they they sent a man their maternity kit uh, for his daughter, who was a teenager, and he got really upset, and then found out that his daughter was actually pregnant, and this national chain knew
Yeah.
that his
It,
daughter was pregnant.
no, it's interesting. This something similar happened in the UK. So I used to work for Tesco, which is basically Walmart, a
Okay.
large supermarket chain, and they bought, but effectively became part of their loyalty program. Was called Club Card, and they used to, and they still do. They give you loyalty points and mainly money off
Yeah, yeah,
coupons
sure.
based on what you're spending. And this was an instance of a fellow was, I think he was buying flowers and condoms at the same time, but in certain locations. And it was clear that he had a mistress, right? But so what? But they didn't really interpret that at that point. It wasn't as smart as it is now, maybe. So they sent coupons for, I think it was condoms and flowers, to his home address, and you can imagine that caused some issues.
Sure, sure. Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah,
I imagine there was some marital strife as a
exactly,
result of that.
exactly. So yeah, it's just interesting. I had the same thing cropped up just some years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm very interested in algorithms from their sort of logical structure and their capacity to make computation work better. Things like that. Difference of squares to multiply numbers is a convenient algorithm for doing mental arithmetic um, quickly. I'm very disturbed by the sort of use of big data and privacy invasion on a scale that's unheard of to interfere with family dynamics and in some cases harm people a great deal. Uh, those instances obviously are very important and personal to those families and definitely arguable one way or another. There are other sort of worse behaviors of you know people like losing their entire online presence because uh, part of their name is a curse word in some language, and then some dumb algorithm decides that because 4 letters in the middle of your name are a curse word, like your entire website can't exist anymore and the backups disappear. Like that's another kind of thing that happens. And even more directly, these sorts of uh, really frauds being perpetrated on the global public of people trading and behaving in ways that make the world look like it's not the way it is, um, in trusted institutions that then cause people to act counter to their own interests so that the person doing this can make more money, is unconscionable, and it should be treated as the criminal act that it is. It cannot be, because structurally there's no way to distinguish between that behavior and desirable behavior in the marketplace. And we are dependent on these markets. If unless you own your own private island with its own nuclear deterrent that doesn't do anything, the North Andaman Islanders that throw spears at anybody that approaches them until they're dead, they don't care. But the rest of us, our food and housing and clothes and everything is dependent on farmers and miners and factories functioning, and functioning profitably so that they'll keep functioning. And 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 these frauds are throwing not just sand but rocks and increasingly boulders into those gears. Um,
That makes a lot of sense. I think one question I have for you, you're obviously very passionate about mathematics, and it's been kind to you and given you a career, etc. Um, if you were to look at the education system, how would you teach mathematics differently, or would you teach it differently to how you were taught when you were at school?
oh yeah, vastly differently. Um, uh, so prefacing this with my lack of expertise in education generally, um, my awareness is that we've never seen anything cause any difference essentially in education. Um, Almost any social change has a problem with habituation, where people are basically people and sort of wind up turning into themselves almost no matter what you do to them. That being said, my own personal fantasy, um, I I would like to see mathematics, because of how big and broad a subject it is. I'd like to see it turned into a lot more units. So my experience and pedagogies I've seen in other parts of the states, and I'm assuming the broader English speaking world, uh, basically builds up numbers. You count, and then you add, and then you multiply, and then you divide, and then you fraction, and then you count, and then you add, and then you multiply, you divide, and then you fraction, and you do that over and over and over again until you're kicked out of school because you're a failure, or you take pre-algebra, and then graduate from high school, or you're on the more advanced class, and then you basically learn rocket science. You do algebra, geometry, trig, calculus, because that's what NASA said it needed to beat the Ruskies to the moon, and so that's what we set up here. I don't know how you guys do it over there. It might be exactly the same. It might be a little bit different. But there's enormously rich mathematical tradition basically in every direction you can conceivably imagine, from wallpaper patterns to Euclidean geometry to combinatorics, which you could relate to like how many ways you can put Legos together, for example. It's crazy. So I would want to see mathematics basically bitten into very large numbers of bite-sized chunks, and very broadly, you know, for 3 weeks we're gonna play with colors, and then for 3 weeks we're gonna like add numbers together, and then for 3 weeks we're gonna do this, and so on. And I would like each of these units essentially to culminate in a test, um, which roughly half the children would fail. I think that's the really important thing. Um, Almost all the great mathematicians, like maybe Gauss was good at everything, but almost all the great mathematicians seem to have really severe deficits at something. Um, uh, and and in many cases they make breakthroughs around those deficits. So nonlinear dynamics and chaos theory, which are reasonably well known thanks to Jurassic Park, basically, was developed by a guy that wasn't really that great at algebra and calculus at a time when differential equations were where mathematics was. But he had a tremendous visual and geometric intuition. And so he used that intuition to come up with a way to approach differential equations which don't have solutions. And while he couldn't solve them, what he could do is characterize their solutions in ways that are useful. And that's where strange attractors and all those sort of pretty, pictures of something moving around sort of wildly in space, if you've ever seen any of those, that's where they all come from. So in mathematics, I think it's sort of important to expose the children to failure, because one, it is hard, and it should be introduced as a hard thing that you're going to fail at. But two, there are approaches available from failure, and if you're just avoiding it, you will avoid those approaches. And that's, I think those are two valuable things that could be done, because math is infinitely difficult. The Terence Tao, who might be the smartest living human being, and was teaching like algebra and calculus to the high school students in his neighborhood when he was 2, uh, and is currently working on, I think, 3 different millennium problems. These are math problems that have $1 million bounties on them, and has made progress on all of them. It's almost trivially easy to come up with questions that he couldn't possibly answer, um, eh, because of things that we know about how computation works. You can pose questions that simply to comprehend must require more more physical states than exist inside a human body. Um, so there just wouldn't be enough mass energy in his brain to approach these questions, and we know how to do that. Like that's one of the things we learned how to do in the 20th century. So that, to me, that would be the approach, and I I think that'd be valuable pedagogically for those reasons, but also because, and this might be kind of a social, promotion thing that was a fad when I was a kid. Um, that approach, I think, would provide more opportunity for the outliers to be discovered. And with how important mathematics is, and how big mathematics is, and how many different sorts of mathematicians have made huge strides in the field, um, I think finding and encouraging and training up those sort of weirdos um, would have a lot more value if we weren't all just sort of running through the "this is how you get to NASA" path, which is what we're really all about here in this country. Uh, and in sort of pop culture-y, like I don't know what British schools work like, but uh, you know, Harry Potter and BBC shows, like I sort of have a sense that you're working on pretty much the same kind of math problems that I got shown when I was a kid. Um, and and it's worth digging up um, Ramanujan's and Gauss's if you can, because those guys are amazing.
That's a interesting place to kind of round the conversation off for today. Thank you very much for your time, Noah, and wish you the best with your, well, I'll say new venture, but your current venture, I suppose. And yeah, look forward to seeing how you get on with it.
Excellent. Thanks for having me. This
Thank
has
you.
been fun.